Good evening, everyone, and welcome to today's conversation. I am Rosevelie Marquez Morales. I'm president of the Hispanic National Bar Association. And on behalf of the HNBA, it is my honor to welcome you to this conversation, celebrating Luminarias of the law, the women whose brilliance not only opened doors, but held them open for generations to come. Tonight is more than professional milestones or historical firsts. It's about presence, it's about perseverance, and it's about the possibility. It's about honoring Latinas who served and continue to serve with distinction while carrying an acute awareness that they often walk into rooms not only as themselves, but often with the hopes, expectations, aspirations of entire communities on their shoulders. For much of our nation's legal history, the contributions of Latina lawyers and judges were not undocumented because they lacked merit, but because these institutions that were responsible for preserving our collective memory did not yet know how to see them. Luminarias is an act of correction. It is a refusal to allow excellence to disappear simply because it was inconvenient, unfamiliar, or ahead of its time in many cases. This evening brings together two women who represent different but deeply connected forms of leadership. One preserved history with rigor, intentionality, and courage. The other lived the history in real time, often without precedent, and with the full weight of what it means to serve justice when few who look like you have stood where you stand before. What makes Luminarias so powerful is that it does not tell a single story. It tells a layered one of scholarship and service, of institutional building and individual sacrifice, of ambition tempered by responsibility, and of excellence shaped by lived experiences. Tonight, we are invited not only to learn, but also to reflect, to consider what it has taken to arrive to this moment, to recognize that representation is not symbolic, it is substantive. It changes how justice is understood, how law is practiced, and how legitimacy is built. As we begin, let us hold some space for gratitude. Gratitude for those who came before us, for those who insisted on being counted, and for those who understood that visibility is not vanity, but duty. And let us leave tonight recommitted to our shared responsibility to preserve truth, to widen pathways, and to ensure that the next generation does not have to ask whether they belong, but only hold boldly that they will lead. Thank you for being a part of this conversation, and welcome. To ground tonight's conversation, it's also important to understand that women whose work and lives brings us together. Dolores Atencio is a legal scholar, author, and former president of the Hispanic National Bar Association, whose work has fundamentally reshaped how the history of Latina lawyers and judges is documented and understood. She's a visiting scholar at the University of Denver Latinx Center at the Strome College of Law. She is the architect of the Luminarias de la Ley, Luminarias of the Law Project, a multi-year scholarly and historical effort that identified, documented the first generation of Latina lawyers, women who earned their law degrees between 1880 and 1990. Through the Luminaria study, conducted across over 167 ABA-accredited law schools, she uncovered long overlooked professional histories and judicial legacies, ensuring these contributions entered the formal legal record. Key findings from the study were published by the UCLA Chicanx Latinx Law Review and later expanded into a law school textbook examining the legal work, careers, and institutional impact of Latina, Article III judges, state Supreme Court justices, and public interest litigators. Her work pairs academic rigor with an explicit call to institutional responsibility, insisting that Latina legal history is preserved, taught, and carried forward. Judge Martha Vazquez is the sixth Latina Luminaria Article III judge among the 17 documented in the Luminaria study and the book. She was nominated by President Clinton on August 6, 1993, appeared before the Senate Judiciary Committee on September 23, 1993, and was confirmed by voice vote on September 30th, just 55 days from referral to confirmation. She is one of two Luminaria Article III judges who previously served as public defenders, bringing a deep understanding of indigent defense and lived client experience to the federal bench. Notably, prior to her federal appointment, she had not served as a judge, underscoring the significance and trust placed in her professional judgment and leadership. Judge Vazquez made history as the first Latina to serve the United States District Court for the District of New Mexico. Her career and jurisprudence are examined in the Luminarias Project and in national legal publications, highlighting how her roots, lived experiences, and commitment to justice shaped her approach to judging. Today is on senior status and continues to hear cases and serve as a model of integrity, mentorship, and judicial excellence. It is with this context that we now turn to a conversation about how history is preserved and why that preservation matters. Dolores, just thinking about the themes of history, visibility, and institutional responsibility that come through when looking at your book and your work. Your work began with the recognition that something essential was missing from the historical record. Can you just start off by sharing with us what gap did you see that had to be filled with the Luminarias project? And why was it also essential for the HNBA and Latina Commission to be a part of all of this work?
I will. Thank you, Rosevelie, for that introduction as well and for the fireside chat today. Um, I'm going to fast forward just a bit to 2015, which is when I began the Luminarias project, when I started the project itself. But by that date, by 2015, we still did not know who the first Latina lawyers were who had received law degrees on the mainland. We knew who the first white female lawyer was, African American, Asian American, and even Native American, but we still did not know in 2015 who the first Latina attorney was. And so pushing back, I served as HNBA president and I often was asked, and that was in the olden days in 91 and 92, and often was asked how many Latina lawyers are in the country. And though I had no clue, would confidently say, we estimate that there are about 500 Latina lawyers in the country. I was off by about 1,000, but we had no idea. And we knew, some of our predecessors, but we really didn't have any idea who these women were. In 1993, Mary Hernandez, who succeeded me, I was the second female HNBA president. Mary became the third. Mary was the convention chair, and she decided that there should be Latina lawyers luncheon. So it was the first. It was in San Francisco at the annual convention. And she asked me to do a luncheon program on some of the first Latina lawyers in the country. She only recently admitted to me that she thought all I had to do to create that program was open up a book and just, borrow from the book and present these women. Well, there was no book. I knew that at the time. And mind you, audience at the time, some of you are younger, there was no internet, there was no laptop computers at that point. This was 93. But because I had been HNBA president, I had a national network of folks that I could turn to. So I turned to people like Cruz Reynoso, Mario Bledo, Mari Carmen Aponte, and others to identify who some of these women were. I identified 21 of them, did a slideshow, which was the technology at the time, and sat there and their photos. We invited them to the luncheon, and that was actually just supposed to be a one-time deal. That was it. It was over. So I didn't document back then how I found them. I did. I'm not sure exactly how. So fast forward to 2008, the Latina Commission was created under then President Ramona Romero. She asked me to chair the commission. I agreed to do that and did so for 2 years. And we picked up as a commission, we picked up the research to try to continue identify who some of the first Latina lawyers were. That's a volunteer position. We found a few more, didn't find who these women were. And by this point in time, I started to become a little obsessed with the idea of trying to figure out who they were. And so I taught at the University of Denver, the Women's College, and taught a research class. And we did additional research and scoured all of the women's bars, the Latino bars, state bars to try to find who our first were. And there again, nobody had the information. So I realized by 2015 that, and in conjunction with the HNBA Latina Commission, published 2 pieces on the milestones or history of Latina lawyers, which I continue to find in bits and pieces. And then realized that really the folks that had the answers to who our first Latina lawyers were in law degree were the law schools. And so you mentioned the study. There were 167 studies. I actually focused on the 100-year period of 1880 to 1980. And after culling records of those 167 law schools, was able to identify approximately 2,500 women who had Spanish sounding last names or Spanish first names. And then what I did was an ancestry search on every single one of them, and then was able to verify ultimately 1,500 Latinas who earned law degrees over the 100-year period, which to me is astoundingly small in numbers. But that's how the project came to be. It was actually a result of HNBA support, and it was through the intergenerational support of the women leaders within the HNBA, with support from our guys as well, to finally identify who these women were. So that resulted, and key findings are in the UCLA article. You can find it by just Googling UCLA Luminarias article. And, and we now have a baseline of the numbers of women, where they went to law schools, which states they were licensed in, what they did with their careers. And so I had then the information of where our luminarias then practiced.
Curious on the reaction when you started to do your research with the law schools. Was there any resistance or any assertions that these stories, just in terms of deserving that formal documentation?
Yeah, I, of course, because I was so enthusiastic about the project, I wrote to every single dean of each law school, believing that they were just going to love the project and get back to me immediately. And of course, they didn't. I remember the one dean who called me, picked up the phone and called me, was the dean of Yale Law School, whose name at the moment escapes me. But two-thirds of the law schools were not happy about the research project. And I asked if they would provide me with a list of their law school graduates. And I started the year that the first female graduated from each of those law schools. And in my letter, I wrote to them and said, it is highly likely that you don't have very many Latina law graduates. And even knowing that, helps authenticate and legitimize the findings of the study. But they refused to provide me with their lists and asserted FERPA as their reason for not disclosing that information. And when I very politely wrote back and said, well, FERPA actually does not prohibit the disclosure of directory information. And in addition, you have already printed that in law school graduation programs, in yearbooks, on your website. But nevertheless, they resisted cooperating with me. There were about a third of the schools that did provide me with lists. And so what I had to do was they granted me access to their documents. Some were more resistant than others, but eventually they did. And I had to cross-reference names from law school graduation programs to yearbooks to newspaper articles, etc., in order to come up with the list. I do recall that one law school, whose name I will not identify, invited me at my own cost to visit their law school and walk the halls of their law school and snap photos of the pictures that they had in their hallways, so that I can then identify who their female graduates were. So it was tough. It was laborious, tedious work for that reason, because of all of the documents that I had to go through.
Yeah, well, we are grateful for your persistence in that space to gather our history. So such an important piece of our history, and it's clear that the study came from a place of heart and passion, and eventually, the study becomes a book, right? Just curious from your perspective, how does this book differ from traditional biographies, or other textbooks?
Well, this book is a law school textbook, and my initial idea was actually to write the history of Latinas, of the Luminarias, their entree into the legal profession, and their journey through the profession. And I presented that idea to Carolina Academic Press. They loved the ideas of the Luminarias, but they market books to law schools. They wanted me to do an academic textbook. So the difference with this particular book is twofold. One, the fact that it's focused on the first Latina Article III judges and state Supreme Court justices. There's not been a book published identifying them and talking about them. And secondly, I could not write a textbook without writing about the Luminarias' backgrounds, about their personal their upbringing as well as their careers. Because as you read the book and you read the biographies that are contained in the book, I don't think you get an understanding of a judge unless you understand how that judge grew up, what their community was about, what values they were exposed to, and the significance of that as they went through their career, as they made their career choices, and then as they got on the bench and began issuing decision. To me, there's a connectivity there that you can't disassociate. So that was the other difference. And then lastly, I did additional research. For example, I looked at how many days it took our Luminarias Article 3 judges from the date that they were nominated, which typically is the date of referral, to the date that they were confirmed. And then I contrasted that data with all the other judges under all the other presidents. And of course, what that resulted in is what I predicted, which is that it took our Luminarias longer to become confirmed than it did in comparison to other judges. So those are the three main differences I would say that are in the book.
When you drafted the book, who did you imagine holding this book 10 years from now?
Well, law students, law professors teaching about our Luminarias work, as well as hopefully, university students, women's studies, those types of groups. But really, I felt when I finished the UCLA article, that was supposed to be the end result of my work in the 7-year study. But then I realized that I knew who our first law professors, judges, public defenders, district attorneys. And so I realized that I could not just allow that information to sit on a bookshelf. I had to get that published. And so what I hope this book actually becomes is the jump off point for other scholars, particularly Latina and Latino scholars, to also study and write about the work of our Latina and Latino jurists. I think one book that would be extremely interesting, at least to me right now, but I'm not writing it, which is to look at the dissents that are written by our Latina and our Latina appellate judges, those on the circuit judges, as well as studying Justice Sotomayor's dissents, because I believe that these dissents are going to be the law of the land tomorrow. So the goal of the book was to get the basic information out there, and then for other scholars to build on that work and develop more our literature on Latina jurists.
So we'll certainly need to share in the chat at some point. So make sure that everyone that's listening and make sure that we have copies of the book in all of our law schools, and that it gets distributed. And sort of transitioning from our scholar over who has preserved the stories to now, hear from our Judge Vazquez, who's lived the story. Obviously the first one in many different spaces. So you didn't have that person that looked like you. But was there someone who believed in you early on, and how did that shape your path?
No, I can't say there was someone that believed in me early on. I think my path was shaped more by seeing my immigrant parents struggle with life in the United States, struggle with the lack of understanding of simple things like how insurance works and the kinds of jobs that are available to them as opposed to other people. And those are the types of things, the unfamiliarity with our English language. Those are the things that shaped me, because when kids go to school, even if you are a Spanish native speaker, you learn English in school. And as you learn English, you learn it faster than your parents generally do. And so you become the family interpreter, not only of the English language, but the culture of the United States.
What was that moment for you that you made the decision, a decision to go to law school in the first place, and then later on even consider the federal bench?
I think it was just seeing that my parents and all of their friends who were also newly arrived immigrants had a life that was very different from people that were born in this country and were from this country. And kids see that at school. At school, when other parents pick up their children and you see what they drive and you see what they look like, and the simple thing of having sandwiches as opposed to burritos in their lunch bag, you appreciate the fact that your life is very different from that of other people. And then you begin to study civics and history. And that is why it's so important that our textbooks be inclusive, because as a child of newly arrived immigrants, it's very exciting to read about the Bill of Rights. It's very exciting, to, even if it's at a grade school level, but learning about a country that welcomes immigrants, learning about a country who's built on immigrants, learning about a country whose constitution doesn't speak as to citizens, but as to all persons. It's very exciting for a child. Remember what we were all like at that time. We're very enthusiastic and we're very optimistic about the future, especially when what you're reading is that type of history and civics lessons. So I learned, I was in grade school, in the third grade specifically, when I decided I was going to be a lawyer. I had never met one before. My parents didn't know any lawyers, but I thought, well, I'm born in a country in which the Constitution is written for everyone, not just for citizens. And I see people living very differently. In California at that time, those little green vans that immigration used to drive would scare the daylights out of people. And everyone was very aware of that green color vehicle that belonged to INS, it was called at that time. And many people were very fearful of it. Not to the extent that people are fearful of it now, because, of the violence that has been associated with that. But nevertheless, it was from a child's point of view, it was a different life that people like my parents and their friends lived. And so I just thought, as simplistically as I was thinking at that time, I thought I'll become a lawyer. And then not only will I know how to speak English, but I'll also know how to help our people. So that's where that idea came from. It wasn't that someone tapped me on the shoulder and said, I believe in you. My parents always worked 2 to 3 jobs, and there wasn't much time for those types of conversations.
I had a conversation last night about Law Day and the American dream, and just listening to your story, the fact is that you had a dream and you were able to achieve that dream. And your lived experiences guided you, catalyst in terms of determining what you wanted for your future. How has your identity as a Latina influenced your own leadership and authority in terms of how you approach things?
I think it's inescapable. As Dolores was saying, in order to know someone, you need to know about their childhood, about how they grew up, in order to put their words and their actions into context. All of the Latina women I knew worked, and they worked out of the house. I did not know one woman who was able to stay at home with the children. All of the Latina women, all the families I knew, in order to make it in the United States, had to have more than one job. So all the kids, all the female children were cooks in the family. Mopped the floors after dinner, did all of that stuff because both parents were working. So you see a work ethic in progress. You see your parents working weekends and working nights. And so you grow up thinking everybody does that and valuing that kind of strong work ethic. I saw my mother never cooking anything but from scratch, never a box, never anything like that. I didn't even know there was instant rice until, I was much older, because we never cooked like that. My mother was, very traditional, and so were all the other women that I grew up with. So, being a Latina, when I was in law school and in college, I thought the hardest thing was just being Hispanic. Just the female part didn't really hit me until I was a practicing lawyer and I wanted to start a family. And I was doing litigation, and as a public defender, I was visiting penitentiaries and prisons to visit clients. And when I got pregnant and doing that, I started to feel very vulnerable and started to feel not just like a Latino lawyer, but a Latino woman. And the way it influenced me was that the way our traditional families measure success is not in the amount of money you make or the kind of car you drive. It's in how well you raise your children. It's in how clean your home is, how well you iron, how neat your children are, and whether you've taught your children how to speak Spanish. And so I found it very difficult to make the transition from a litigating lawyer to a judge. My youngest was only 3. I had 4 children, and it went 3, 5, 7, and 9. And all of a sudden I'm absent from home. And I felt immediately that I was letting my family and my background down. And, to be gone for days at a time was not something that my children had ever experienced. So although I carried the pride and determination of being the first woman on the bench here in New Mexico, on the federal bench, I always felt like I was letting my children down and my family down. And that's a very difficult burden to carry if you come from traditional families. And where that leads is that you don't have time for socializing. All you're doing is working and learning this new job, and you feel so inept in both worlds. And so the last thing you're going to do is call your female friends and see if you can go out to lunch or do something, because you're trying to hurry so you can get home. The other regret I have, that I understand why it happened, was that I never got involved, except for a few meetings and presentations, but I didn't get involved with the HNBA. And that's really a loss for me. But I was so overwhelmed with my children, with being 4 hours away from my home for much of the year, because we all had to go to the southern part of the state to handle the high load of criminal and immigration cases. And if you're the first woman, the last thing you're going to do is say, hey guys, I'm a mom. Do you mind covering for me? My kids have a pageant at school or something like that. And I knew that what they would do is not only roll their eyes, but say, see, this is why we can't have any women around. So, you do the best you can, feeling all the while that it's not good enough.
George, thank you so much for that vulnerability that you have shared with us. We know many of our women, still struggle with that. And curious if, what can you share for parents and caregivers that when ambition and family do feel that tension? What advice, if anything, do you have for women that are starting families?
The joys of having children, I think, make all of the sacrifices and the insecurities that you may have just worth it. When I was before coming to the bench, I remember I represented a teachers union, and one of our teachers was charged with sexual assault, and there must have been like 8 or 10 girls that were making this accusation. And I actually had my kids come to the trial because I had been absent from home so much doing the trial preparation and the investigation and taking photographs of the scene and all that, that when they came to see what I was doing, all of a sudden I would get home. Mom, can I get you some cafecito? Mom, what can I do for you? Mom, I mean, it's like, I thought, I should have done this a long time ago, because they saw that I wasn't out, playing around with other women and going out for drinks and doing this stuff. I was trying to save this man's freedom. And all of a sudden, they couldn't do enough for me at home. So my advice would be to share with your children what you're doing, what you're worried about at work, what you're trying to accomplish. And it's just amazing how, even as young as they are, they get it and they become protective and less selfish about, but you're not home. I want to go play. I want to do this. And, all of a sudden, what can I do?
Yes, lean into that family. And for those of you who don't have a family, lean into the HNBA familia. I mean, that is one thing that we do serve for each other. And I know that the energy that I often get when I attend a conference, it just really fills my cup when I have to go back out there and do the difficult work. So thank you again for not only sharing, but the sacrifices that you've made and to represent our community so well. Noted in the book, like from 2004 to 2018, there were 3 Luminarias that served together as Article 3 judges on the bench. What was that like for you at that point, either professionally, personally, or just institutionally?
So you're referring to the time in which Judge Herrera and Judge Armijo joined the bench? Well, it was incredible to have 3 Latinas all of a sudden on our bench. But Judge Herrera also had young children. As a matter of fact, our boys went to school together, and she was doing the same thing I was doing, is just trying to make it to the games after school, as well as preparing for the next day's hearings. So we didn't see each other very much. That socializing is so important, but it is such a luxury. The work that, Dolores Atencio did, as I was reading about all of these women, I thought, I wish I'd known that they existed at the time, because just that knowledge alone, would have helped me be stronger in this quest. And you doubt yourself. You doubt yourself because you may be doing well on the work front, but you doubt yourself in terms of, but am I providing my children with the presence and the maternal contributions to their life that I would be if I weren't having to prove myself every day at this job. But it was wonderful to have them. It was, even if we didn't get to see each other too much, because we worked in different parts of the state, but it was still wonderful.
I can imagine it's empowering to have the 3 of you present, even though you weren't directly involved on a daily basis, just sort of having that proud moment of reflection, actually seeing someone that looked like you on the bench, which is so powerful still today for young girls that are looking out there and deciding, what can I do, right? They're able to see you. They're able to see scholars like Dolores. They're able to see many of us and see that there's options, right? Curious a little bit about your just experience on the bench, given your background and, as a Latina and in our own immigrant experiences and sort of stories, how has that, influenced in terms of your understanding of justice and how has that evolved over time?
I'm at the trial level, and I love being at the trial level. I've loved it from day one. as Dolores said, one's background, one's lived experiences have so much to do with the work you do because it affects the way you see the world. And I remember feeling like, I can't believe I got this job. I had a personal injury case involving a young mother who was no longer able to carry her children and lift them. And, you think, my God, the question was, what is that worth to be able to do that at home? Well, we know as Latino women that you get home and you start dinner. You get home and everyone's hungry, and what's for dinner, Mom? And your next job starts at that time. And then there are baths to give your kids, and then there's homework to check. So the way I view what it's worth to not be able, as a litigant, to do the types of things that we know we all do and we know other women do, it's very important to have that perspective because, the fact is that most of my male colleagues at the time in 1993, when I came on the bench, their wives picked up the groceries on their way home. Their wives picked up the dry cleaning. Their wives made the dinner when they invited all of us to their house for dinner, or they had little guys in white coats running around. That's not our reality, and that's not our experience. So, yes, diversity matters, if for no other reason than to be able to understand what is real and what might be excessive in terms of a litigant's request for damages. If we allowed most of the judiciary to come from prep schools, it would be another loss because the idea of knowing what kind of effort it takes for parents to make mortgage payments or just to be able to buy a home, to see as a child your parents struggling and everybody meeting and figuring out how are we going to pay for this and should we not do this so that we can pay for this. Those are the types of things that are extremely important in terms of resolving cases. One example I'll give you is, what does remorse look like? Since we do so much criminal work, what does remorse look like to you? I think it's so culturally based. And yet that determination of whether someone is being sincere, whether someone is remorseful, has so much to do with who we are and what we've seen. And, we have Native American litigants, and we have Mexican parties and litigants who are very humble. And it isn't appropriate to look directly at someone else's eyes. It's considered rude in some parts. And so you have to look at that and look at the whole person and say, this person's not being defiant. This person is not lacking in remorse. This person is just humble. And if they are uneducated in the formal ways of education, then you can understand how they may say, I have nothing to say. And that may be criticized by other cultures. What? This is your opportunity to speak and you don't bother to say, I'm sorry, you don't apologize, you don't do this. Well, it takes quite a bit of self-confidence to be in a large courtroom in which you don't know anyone and to advocate for yourself. We have to invite people from all paths of life into these important positions so that mistakes are not made.
Thank you so much. I mean, particularly today, in the moment that we're facing in society, when sometimes diversity is frowned upon, and when in truth, right, that value of understanding those cultural nuances and appreciating and seeing beyond what's being presented, really does strengthen your ability to interact on a human connection. At the end of the day, it is all about us as humans and as people. Uh, and from what I'm hearing you, I'm sure there's been plenty of times where you've had to balance that, impartiality with empathy. Uh,
Yes.
how do you go about that?
That's a tough one. That really is a tough one. My very first criminal case, I was reversed by the 10th Circuit because I did not grant a motion for directed verdict. And the reason I didn't grant it was because my gut was telling me that I should grant it, that there wasn't enough evidence to convict this young man. That I thought, oh my God, Martha, there's got to be your public defender bias. This is a jury, for God's sakes. They have found, the respect we have for juries. They have made a decision. Well, I got reversed on that, and I thought, great, this is great. Because it taught me not to discard my gut feelings about things, and to have more confidence and to be thankful that there is a 10th Circuit with much more time than a trial judges have to ponder, to research, to do all of this. And it was a great lesson for me. I think we have to be mindful of what we know as our biases. We have to be mindful and check them and make sure that in deciding the case, it is based on objective grounds and the law, of course. But part of that evaluation includes, our lived experience. Many people in society suffer from childhoods that are extraordinarily difficult. And I don't mean just poor, I just mean traumatic. And so many people in our society have mental health illnesses. And we're just beginning to do the very hard work of recognizing that those are very debilitating, that those are invisible, that those do not curry much sympathy for most people. And as a matter of fact, people are stigmatized because of that. Well, it's become such a prevalent issue in our criminal cases that we need to be able to understand that these things do exist. And they exist because a certain portion of our societies live lives that are extremely violent and extremely difficult. If you come from a world in which there wasn't anything like that, if you come from a world in which you can't imagine children not having both parents and enough to pay for a warm bed and food in the fridge, sometimes it's difficult to really understand the depth of the effects of a childhood in which someone raised themselves in the streets, and how that would affect that person. I mean, I had a mother that was always scolding us about the language you used, the way you treated people, whether you said your prayers before, whether you used your hands or your fork when you're eating, all of that stuff. But many of the people that I have worked with in court, they raised themselves. They raised themselves in the street because either one parent was too sick and unable to, or because there was addiction or whatever. We have to be open-minded enough before we make lasting, binding decisions. We have to consider the individual that comes before us. And the more experienced we are, the broader outlook we have, I think the harder our experiences are, it helps us be able to, more accurately assess things. And that's what a trial judge does. We assess the strength of the law. We assess the credibility of a witness testifying and telling their story. And so we have to be able to be accepting of many other ways of thinking, ways of viewing the world, ways of looking, ways of expressing yourself.
Judge, it's clear one of the qualities that you exemplify and is so important to a judge in your position is that of introspectiveness, right? And being able to have that sort of self-reflection. For those that are, listening and aspiring to be judges, what are some of the qualities that you think are critical to be a judge?
I think depending on whether you want to be an appellate judge or a trial judge, for trial judges, you really, have got to love litigation, and be experienced in litigation. I think all law students need to think about this other thing, that whether you want to be an appellate judge or a trial judge, you have to guard your reputation, with everything you've got. And we were all involved in very hotly contested cases in which opposing counsel sends you a letter and you start shaking before you open it, because some people get personal or whatever, and you go home with knots in your stomach. And we need to think about at all times how we respond. How you respond to a nasty lawyer, how you respond in court to a judge that you don't think is prepared and fully understands your position or whatever. Keeping always in mind that no one and nothing is worth our integrity and our honesty and our reputation for truthfulness. Because the background searches that are done for people that are applying for any of these positions always include opposing counsel and the judges that you've appeared before. And, when people can say that you have a strong work ethic, and that starts in law school, when people can say, when this person tells me that this is what their research indicates, as a judge, there are some people who've lost their good reputation because of behavior in a particular case. And so the next time they're before you, you kind of wonder, I better check this because I'm just not sure. And so it's extremely important, especially in close cases, that you be somebody that the judge knows is thorough and honest. So if you want to judge a position like this, those are very important aspects of the background investigation that are done. You wouldn't believe how personal the questions get from the FBI agents that are vetting somebody. They want to know whether you've lived beyond your means. They want to know whether you drink too much. The idea is that you can be compromised. And so what people think of you and what people see you do in public is something that is extremely important, and we always have to be mindful of. You may never even think about wanting to be a judge or wanting to be a law school professor or wanting to serve in a presidential cabinet. But, timing sometimes is just amazing. And you don't want to be in a position where, yeah, I think I would like that kind of work, but you can't have it because of people seeing you in town doing stuff that you shouldn't be doing. So what my advice is, be very, very careful about how you write a brief and whether you overstate the law, about positions that you take, about your personal behavior, because all of that is important for any important government position or for teaching in law schools. And we need Latinas in all of these positions, if for no other reason than to have little girls think, I can do this. I think I would be really good. I think, I can see myself, in you, Rosevelie. They need to be able to see us. Otherwise, it's very hard to dream like other kids dream.
As a mom of two girls, I'm always looking for opportunities to introduce them to all the amazing women that I have had the privilege of meeting through the HNBA in particular, because it's so important for them to sort of see all that they can be amongst our members in particular. And I mean, Dolores, just kind of picking up on the same theme. I mean, you heard the stories, you've written about the stories. Are there any other sort of themes and things that you saw across the experiences of these amazing Latina women that they exemplified that our folks should keep in mind as they're thinking about, if I want to be a judge? You're on mute.
Uh-oh.
Sorry. My husband came in and I had to make sure that you all didn't hear him. So excuse me. The roughly half of the Article 3 judges were judges before they were appointed to the bench, and it actually might be a little higher than that. And so that's sort of the trajectory, if there is one, relative to becoming an Article 3 judge. The other statistic that comes to mind, and I'm not sure it speaks to your question, but the other thing is that there were more than double the number of Luminaria Article 3 judges than there were state Supreme Court justices. So there were 17 Luminarias who became Article 3 judges to the 8 who became judges of last resort. So that tells us, and that's still true, there are more Article 3 Latina judges than there are state Supreme Court justices. And in the book, it contains lists of both all of the Article 3, the Luminaria and Latina Article 3 judges, and then all of the Luminarias and Latinas who became state Supreme Court justices. But it is more difficult to become a state Supreme Court justice than it is to become a federal judge, which I find incredibly interesting. But it really speaks to, I think, the drive and the significance of the Luminarias. What real always struck me about them is, and I think of them as them, even though I'm a baby Luminaria because I'm in the last group, from roughly 1917 when the first Latina became an attorney, Herminia Tormes Garcia, who graduated from the University of Puerto Rico in 1917. From that point to 1969, there were roughly 300 Latinas who earned law degrees. The majority of the luminarias in that first generation earned law degrees between the one decade of 1970 to 1980. So those who came before up to 1969, they came in at a time of pre-affirmative action programs. So they really plowed through all of the obstacles without any affirmative action programs, which means money in terms of getting into law schools. And their accomplishments are amazing. And then those that from 1970 to the 80s, they came in at the dawn of segregation because the legal profession was, and to a large extent remains, a segregated profession. It was clearly was not segregated uh, up until affirmative action programs. And those programs really made a difference in terms of increasing our numbers of luminarias, because in that one decade alone, there were approximately 1,200 Latinas who earned law degrees, in contrast to all of the previous 7 decades. So their tenacity, and even those who earned law degrees in the 70s through 1980, they were the first. They were the first entering solo practices. They were the first becoming county judges, city attorneys, district attorneys, public defenders, legal aid attorneys. And so they had to break through not only the barriers in terms of race, but the barriers towards gender, the biases towards gender, and then having to wrestle with our own families, with our own culture in terms of what was expected of us, as Martha has pointed out, what was expected of us as women, as Latinas. Many of us grew up with very traditional families. And so the milestone, the accomplishments of the Luminarias always struck me as I became HNBA president and as I got to meet some of these women. I sat back and I kept asking, how is it that this group distinguished themselves? And that's probably the other thing that struck me is the degree to which, as a group, this first generation of Latinas, of Luminarias, distinguished themselves in almost every facet of the legal profession, including ascending to the federal bench, as Judge Vazquez did in New Mexico. But those are the things that drove me, and sort of trying to finding the answer to the elusive question, how is it? How is it that they became lawyers? And you can even pose that question to the second generation of Latina lawyers, to you, Rosevelie, and to others that we know, our contemporaries, our colleagues. What made the difference between your becoming a lawyer, your being able to get into law school and succeeding, and those of us with many cousins and sisters who are just as intelligent but didn't have that opportunity? And I think part of what's out there is, it's, as Martha said, it's destiny. Part of it is the stars align, and we were fortunate and are fortunate to be in a very elitist profession. And so it is important, therefore, what we found through the HNBA research in our two studies in 2009 and 2010 is that there were no role models. There are insufficient role models for our youth. And so part of the drive behind writing and producing literature about the Luminarias is to give our younger generations something to read, something to learn, and to understand that they too can actually succeed within the legal profession. I'm not sure at all that I answered your question, but that's my answer.
Equally as important, and I think you reflect about the importance of access, right? And what we do in terms of preserving and ensuring that we have a pipeline, particularly at this moment when so many programs that do give people the opportunity are being kind of pulled away. What responsibility do we have as attorneys, as Latinas, as members of our community, to make sure that we stay visible and that we stay accessible to young women who want to become attorneys? And that actually is a great transition to a question that we have here from our past president, Carlos Boyal, who is asking, how can listeners help support the work of the Luminarias? And is there a fundraising initiative?
Oh, wow. I wish you were around, Carlos, when I was doing fundraising for the research. I will tell you, and we'll share that, certainly the Luminarias Project accepts donations. Obviously, I'm at the University of Denver, so those contributions would be made there. But also, you can purchase the book, which is very helpful. And I will share that I was not paid to do the work. The University of Denver and the law school gave my project a home, but in doing that, and bestowed upon me the title of visiting scholar, but I was not paid to do the work. I also had to research. I had to fundraise in order to do the research. And so I think that certainly in purchasing the book, if all of you would ask your law library, your law schools to purchase the book, because what I realize in the course of this is that the law libraries, the law school libraries will purchase books that you ask them to purchase so that those books are available. But certainly, I think more importantly is contributing to and supporting the pipeline activities that the Latina Commission has implemented. When we did the study in 2009, for example, Latina law students were only at 4% of all law students in the country. They are now at probably about 9.2% of all entering law students. So we're pretty much at parity or near parity to our population. But supporting through, scholarships is important, as well as contributing to the programs of the HNBA would certainly continue to help this second generation of Latina lawyers.
Thank you, Dolores. I realize we are at time, but I think that's a great sort of transition to remind ourselves that, this work is not yet completed. We are present. There's still so many stories to be told. and how we contribute to that is really important. And we appreciate the work that you continue to do, Dolores, and thank you, Judge Vazquez, for the work that you've done and that you will do, just serving as a mentor, and being visible and spending time with us. It's so important that we be seen. And that we step into that. I mean, many times we're doing this great work, as you said, we're moms, we're professionals, and we're taking care of everyone. And it's important that our stories be told and that we tell them and that we step into that unapologetically, authentically, and fully, because it's not just simply about the first, but it's also a call to a responsibility that we have to make sure that our history is preserved, and also that for future generations that we're here. So I just want to thank Dolores, and I want to thank Judge Vazquez, both for preserving our truth with courage and for embodying the excellence and leadership that you do on the bench. I hope we leave here even more committed to widening our pathways and really telling our stories. We do have now a committee on legal education, and it is mostly legal faculty. So we'll certainly connect with them and make them ask, right? Can you please purchase this book? And we'll certainly share the link out to folks that have joined together, and we'll continue to encourage people not only to purchase the book, but also to read and tell those stories. I think it's important that we tell our children, that we have those conversations about the first at home. And I welcome all of you to do that, and hope to see many of you at our upcoming annual conference in September at the Gaylord. But thank you very much again for joining us this evening.
Thank you for having us.